Comrades and friends, good evening and welcome to this event hosted by Labour and Palestine entitled Women for Palestine. It's a timely event occurring as it does just before International Women's Day this Friday. I'm Christine Blower. I'm a Labour member of the House of Lords. I'm a lifelong trade unionist and in particular an internationalist and international solidarity activist. We meet, of course, at a time when for all of us who are interested in campaigning in particular for and with Palestine, at the height of what the ICJ has said is a plausible genocide. We meet at a time where the government, though, is trying to put hurdles in the way of protest, in the light of massive movements for peace and for justice. And that means that we have to be on the streets and we have to be campaigning on the streets and in our workplaces and wherever we can on this vital issue. All the current signs are that even now, human rights abuses against the people of Palestine are intensifying. We know the horrifying numbers of deaths, although there may very well be significantly more deaths with people lying as yet undiscovered under the rubble of the buildings in which they lived and worked and went to school. And clearly there are massive forces acting against Palestinian people's right to self-determination. So today we'll be discussing how Palestinian women are at the forefront of campaigning for the rights of Palestinians today. They're defending themselves, their homes, their land, their children and their people. And in this context, it's good to see how much support there is for the people of Palestine within the Labour Party, amongst ordinary Labour Party members in the Labour movement and of course beyond, notwithstanding the fact that the Labour front bench has signally failed to call for an immediate ceasefire. Many MPs, Labour MPs, have called for that immediate ceasefire. And if your own MP hasn't, then maybe you should check out why not. And of course, there's been lots of interest in the work of Labour in Palestine. 15,000 people from over 650 constituencies have signed the Labour in Palestine's petition to the Labour leadership. So Labour in Palestine is a platform launched at Labour conference in 2018. It's supported by the trade unions ASLEF, the CWU, the NUM, TSSA, Unison and Unite the Union. You'll note that they're Labour affiliated unions. So if yours isn't there, that's probably the reason. We're delighted to have a range of speakers with us today who will put the case, all women, I might say, who will put the case that Palestine, more than ever, needs our solidarity and that we need to be able to amplify the voices of those women in Palestine who are struggling on their own behalves. So I'll introduce the speakers as we come to them. And our first speaker is Apsana Begum MP, who is, of course, a completely brilliant MP and a tireless fighter for peace and justice on the front, on Palestine, but on so much else. So Apsana, the floor is yours. We're delighted you're here.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. It's a pleasure always to join panels such as this, talking about the most important issue, one of the most important issues of our time. For all of us, watching the unconscionable suffering being inflicted on the Palestinian people is unbearable. Knowing that more than 30,000 Palestinians have been murdered in Gaza and still continue to see bombs fall on them is unbearable. Watching children begin to die from malnutrition and starvation, hearing the director of the UN World Health Organization call Gaza a death zone is unbearable. Doctors Without Borders tell us that children as young as 5 are now saying that they wish to die rather than continue to live in these conditions. An entire generation of children are being subjected to unimaginable trauma. And what is so hard, I think, to stomach is that these conditions are deliberately being imposed on civilians in Gaza by the Israeli government with the full support and backing of our own government in the UK. Every day that this slaughter is allowed to continue unchecked, Israel deploying arms our government sold to them to murder Palestinian civilians is a stain on our nation's conscience. I find myself asking again and again, how many more Palestinians have to die before our government acknowledges that Palestinian lives matter? How many before they say this is enough. People all over the UK see clearly and understand that starving civilians, destroying schools, hospitals, and targeting refugee camps can never ever be viewed to be part of a legitimate military operation. So why is our government so willfully blind? I was thinking today that increasingly I just don't have the words left anymore to describe the horror that continues to be inflicted on Palestinians living in Gaza. We on this call are not asking for words from our government. We are asking for action. Action to ensure that the urgent humanitarian aid that is needed can actually reach the people of Gaza. Action to immediately halt arms sales to Israel. Action to pressure to make an unequivocal demand to the Israeli government for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And as we speak, more than 1 million displaced Palestinians, about half of Gaza's population, are crammed into Rafah after being forcibly displaced there, and after being told finally that they would be safe there. We say, not in our name. Amidst the horror, this cry of humanity and solidarity that we are continuing to see in response to the situation is getting louder and louder, and it is this that gives us hope. I believe we're a global movement of people from every background, every age, every religion, and every gender. And I draw strength from the unwavering solidarity of thousands of people in my own constituency, people across Tower Hamlets, across East London and beyond, who will never stop standing with Palestine. And I, of course, will continue to stand and call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, as I have done since October. But we know that a ceasefire is not the end, it is just the beginning, and we demand nothing less than peace, freedom, and equality for the Palestinian people. So I will close by saying, please let's continue to draw our strength from each other, from this global movement that we are a part of, that every day continues to grow. And please let's continue to draw our strength from the steadfastness of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Apsana, thank you very much for opening our meeting and for making such a clear presentation about what needs to be done. I'm going to move now to our second speaker, Rachel Garnham, who was formerly a member of Labour's NEC and of the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy. Rachel, it's always a pleasure to have you on meetings, and we're delighted that you've made the time to be with us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for inviting me to speak, and thanks to Labour and Palestine for organising this event for International Women's Day, and for all the work you do to make the voice of ordinary Labour Party members on Palestine heard. The voices of women are too often drowned out, so I want to say something first about women's voices here, and then about women's voices in Palestine, and then what we can do about it. First, I want to say it's an enormous privilege to share a platform with Beth and Apsana. It's a great platform all round, but left women MPs have been leading the way in Parliament in calling out the injustices, the breaches in international law, calling for an end to arms to Israel, and keeping up the pressure both on the government and the shadow front bench to stop enabling genocide. And they're doing an amazing job, and make no mistake, that pressure is working. Labour has shifted its position many times in response to pressure from its voters and from its backbenches and from its members and from the public, and so it should and so it must. What is troubling me is the attempt to efforts to silence these women MPs' voices. So under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, we had many fantastic women MPs enter Parliament, women who truly represented their communities and are prepared to stand up for basic principles of human rights, peace and justice, which is what we expect from our Labour MPs. But it is genuinely chilling the lengths to which the current Labour leadership will go to silence those pro-Palestinian voices, be it through stitching up reselections, trumped up disciplinary charges, or pushing issues into the long grass. And there is a serious risk that these voices will not be in Parliament come the next election, not enough of them, for no other good reason than these champions for women have been forced aside. And part of our campaigning must be to ensure that we draw attention to the flawed processes and demand justice for Diane Abbott, Kate Osmore, Apsana and others, so they can keep speaking out for Palestine. Those voices are so important, and it's typical of the Labour right that they cannot win the argument, so they shut it down. Second, obviously, the most important thing is that we amplify women's voices in Palestine. I think we absolutely must hear from the mother who cannot feed her children, the grandmother dying in pain because hospitals have been demolished and she cannot get her cancer treatment. Only this week, just to share some stories, I know we know them, but the story of Razan, an 11-year-old girl who survived a strike on her uncle's home in Gaza City, but has lost her mother, father, brother and 2 sisters, and who has had her leg amputated, is now living with her displaced aunt and uncle in Rafah. I read today about the couple who had taken 11 years to conceive, whose baby twins were killed in Israel's latest airstrike on Rafah, a safe place apparently. And I read about Anhar Saka al-Shabari, a toddler girl who has starved to death. Sorry about the pronunciations, but we need to know these women's names and hear them. At least 9,000 women have been killed. 2 mothers are killed every hour. Gaza's only 2 women's shelters, both in Gaza City, are now closed. The number of households where a widowed woman has the sole responsibility to feed, protect and provide for her family have surged by at least 3,000. 84% of women report that their family eats half or less of the food they used to before the war began, with women taking a step back to allow others in the family to eat. For families with elderly relatives or family members with disabilities who simply cannot move, it is women who are disproportionately stay behind as caregivers. Pregnant and breastfeeding women are particularly at risk of undernutrition and malnutrition, heightening the risk of birth defects and death. Antenatal and maternal care are limited. Lack of sanitary supplies and facilities to dispose of them properly affects women and girls' dignity, as well as their mental and physical health. 13 women journalists and numerous women health workers have been killed. I know that people on this call know how appalling the situation is, but we have a responsibility to keep looking at those appalling facts square in the face and amplifying those voices. It's very interesting looking at the polling, which shows 71% of the British population are in favour of an immediate ceasefire. If you look at the breakdown of that between men and women, there are many women amongst the don't knows. And I think we all have a responsibility to talk to our sisters, our friends, family, through in our workplaces, in wherever we are, to explain what is going on for women in Palestine. As Rosa Luxemburg, whose birthday is today, said, the most revolutionary thing one can do is to proclaim loudly what is happening, and that is what we're doing today. So what else can we do? We have to keep protesting out on the streets in our capital cities and in our local areas. We have to be clear we are not going away, and we have public opinion on our side. Let us show our solidarity however we can, keep holding our MPs to account, as Christine said. We must up our commitment to boycott, divestment and sanctions. We must up our knowledge of what specifically we should be boycotting, share this information with family and friends so that we can hit companies where they feel it most in their profits. We must call on any organisations where we have influence, including in our workplaces, to divest from investments based in Israel and the arms trade. And we must uphold the right to speak out on Palestine. I'm very pleased that my union branch passed a motion today on the right to speak out on Palestine, drawing attention to the attack on Queen Mary UCU branch, which people may have seen, who had their offices broken into by their management and posters showing solidarity with Palestine removed. So we show our solidarity with them. And finally, we must keep up the pressure on the government and on Starmer and his unprincipled hangers-on however we can. We have to continue to use all avenues at our disposal, however much ignored we sometimes feel, bringing our motions through the Labour Party and our trade unions. CLPD's recently circulated a new resolution on arms to Israel. We're not going away. The people of Palestine have not given up in 75 years and they continue to resist, so we must not give up on them. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much. And following brilliantly in the footsteps of Rosa Luxemburg by listing all all those things that are going on, we absolutely do have to speak out and speak up so that anyone who is still unaware of the situation becomes aware of the situation. So our next speaker, I'm very pleased to to introduce, is Jess Barnard, a current Labour NEC member and a big supporter of Labour in Palestine. Jess, we're delighted you're here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. And I just want to echo the words of the previous speakers. I think when we're talking about this, it's important to talk about the context of what's happened in Palestine and for Palestinians. And we're now 76 years on from the Nakba, and Palestinians have been subjected to occupation, to apartheid, to death, to instability, dehumanization, and that's at the hands of Israel with the support, the diplomatic support, but also the military support from Britain and the US and many global powers. And when I visited Palestine last year, I saw firsthand how Palestinians in the West Bank are subject to violence from illegal settlers who inflict violence upon them and take their homes, enabled and supported by the Israeli military. We saw how shopkeepers in Hebron are forced to arbitrarily close their shops, placed under curfew, denied the freedom to leave their homes or operate their businesses or live any form of a normal life. And for refugees confined to camps under 24/7 surveillance by Israeli snipers and ever shrinking cages that surround them, and students who are trying to go to school to live a normal life, there are constant searches of their belongings. The school buses are held and they never know whether they will be making it to school that day, because often they can be held for hours at a time. And these are just like a few of the stories that have been going on for decades. And most of us in Britain, we can't comprehend what it's like for whole generations of families to be born and to live and to die under occupation. But that's what the reality has been for Palestinians for decades. And most of us in Britain can never know or truly understand the horrific crimes that are being committed against the people of Gaza by Israel and those countries who are complicit. I know we have all seen the disgraceful bombardment of Gaza, 30,000 people killed that we know of, 1.7 million people displaced and under the threat of further attack, and now under the threat of constant starvation. We've all heard the horrific stories, and I think it's important to note it is internationally recognised that women and children are disproportionately impacted by war. And as Rachel has already explored, the direct impact of the bombardment of Gaza on Palestinian women, and the men, women and children of Gaza have all been failed by the UK, the US and much of the international community. And I think it's an utter disgrace that this country has cut humanitarian aid when it is the difference between starvation and survival. And the struggle for healthcare, the struggle for a safe home, the right to food, to freedom from living under bombardment and occupation and apartheid is a struggle for justice, but it's also a feminist struggle. And that should be amplified across the world, especially on this International Women's Day this week. And we have to remember those so-called feminists that occupy a lot of our public life in Britain who have nothing to say on the women of Palestine, and we should challenge them, because any feminist should be speaking up in support of Palestine and the Palestinian women. And the political class in both major parties, if you've heard and you will have seen, haven't just failed to show leadership, they have stamped over the voices of Palestinians. And I think it's up to every single one of us not to look away and not to step away from challenging those politicians. The government have obviously mobilized the full force of the state through media, through police and propaganda to describe solidarity marches as hate marches. But we know that those in reality are hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, who are coming together in solidarity with the people of Gaza and to call for a ceasefire, to say enough is enough, and to say loudly and clearly we support a ceasefire now. We need an end to the bombardment, and we need our so-called representatives to do what they were elected to do. And I'm not talking about the brilliant MPs that we have here on the call, but instead those who have failed to support a ceasefire despite their constituents calling for them to do so. And, you know, a message to those MPs: represent your constituents, represent the overwhelming millions of people calling for a ceasefire, and do everything within your power, from diplomacy to calling for an end to arms sales to Israel, to bring about an end to the genocide on Gaza, because it is your duty to do so. And in the Labour Party, once again, obviously, Keir Starmer has failed to represent us. Once again, he has gone against the calls of 80% of Labour members who back a ceasefire, 80%. And so Keir Starmer, when he was elected as seeking election as Labour leader in 2020 in January, he made the members a series of promises. And I don't want to dwell for too long on the long list of broken promises of Keir Starmer, but the consequences of abandoning these particular commitments are absolutely disastrous. And he said he would pass legislation that military action could only be taken with the consent of the Commons. He promised to put human rights at the heart of foreign policy. He promised to review all UK arms sales to make Britain a force for international peace. He said he would halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia, that he said were creating the horrifying humanitarian suffering in Yemen. And on all of these cases, he's gone back on his promises and he lied. Now, we can feel very frustrated about the situation of the Labour leadership, but despite what he says or how it presents, he is worried, and much of the political class are worried, and there is a reason they are trying to clamp down on our rights to protest or for our rights to be able to lobby our MPs, and it's because they know their position is indefensible and untenable. And after the public outcry and opposition to Starmer following his comments about Israel having the right to withhold food and power from Palestinians, he faced a huge amount of backlash, and Labour MPs were going to Starmer worried about their situation, worried about the majorities, challenging him on his comments, and worried that the public might put them out of the job at the next election. So he's desperately been trying to clamp down on voices speaking up for Palestine as a result. But that is why we need to keep the pressure up, to keep building opposition to warmongering in the Labour movement. And those of us within Labour, we have a duty to organise wherever we can, whether that's in our CLPs, whether that's supporting local groups within Labour to shift the Labour position, including supporting Labour for Palestine, of course. And let's make it clear to Starmer that we won't be silent, because it's the duty of all of us. And whether you're inside or outside Labour, keep turning up to demonstrate, keep boycotting, keep supporting the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and of course, amplifying the voices of the Palestinian people, and refuse to be silent, because the Labour movement doesn't stand by while tens of thousands of Palestinians are murdered and forcibly displaced, starved and threatened. We stand against illegal wars, and we organise for freedom and for peace.
Yes, thank you very much indeed for those remarks, completely appropriate remarks. Let me turn now to our second MP on our panel this evening. Our second MP is Beth Winter, who comes to us from Wales. Now, I have got very few words of Welsh, Beth. I'm going to say Prynawn da. Is that afternoon or is that evening? Anyway, whatever it is, we're really delighted that you're here. I must say, one of the great pleasures of being in the House of Lords is that I get to go to meetings of the Socialist Campaign Group and meet with women like Apsana and like Beth. She's a really good campaigner, is Beth, and we're delighted she's with us this evening. Beth, the floor is yours.
Diolch yn fawr, Christine. A noswaith da I bawb ar y galwen. So good evening to everybody on the call. And thank you to Labour and Palestine for inviting me to today's Women and Palestine discussion ahead of this week's International Women's Day. It is right and critically important that we give time to consider the lives of women in Palestine. And there is much to discuss, as the previous speakers have already outlined. Now, in more peaceful circumstances, we might consider the conflicts of historically patriarchal society and the limitations of conservative religious influence on representative politics, with the flourishing of a network of self-organised women's organisations throughout Palestinian civil society, and the historic role of women providing leadership to the struggle against illegal occupation. From the Palestinians Women's Union, established back in the 1920s, to the Women's Work Committees of the 1970s, or the current Women's Centre for Legal Aid and Counselling. Individuals such as Hanan Ashrawi, an early minister in the Palestinian Authority, to Huwaida Araf, who co-founded the International Solidarity Movement, or Ahmed Tamimi, twice imprisoned at a young age and now a popular figurehead. But we are not in peaceful circumstances. It was in fact the Palestinian women's rights activist Randa Signora who said back in 1987, and I quote, "It became impossible to focus exclusively on legal and social aspects of women's rights, with human rights violations taking place against Palestinian women every day. Now our main task is documenting those violations." The UN Women's Survey of partner organisations in Gaza in November showed that 83% of women's organisations surveyed in the Gaza Strip are now mainly focusing on the emergency response. However, UN Women's analysis of funding to the 223 flash appeal reveals that less than 0.1% of funding has directly gone to those women's rights organisations. Therefore, we must focus on the impact of the current catastrophe facing civilians and women in particular who are disproportionately affected by the catastrophe along with children in Gaza and to a lesser extent, but importantly, we mustn't forget the West Bank. Analysis by academics in the US has argued Israel has carried out its war in Gaza at a pace and level of devastation that likely exceeds any recent conflict, including bombing that took place in Syria and Iraq in the past decade. Michael Link, who served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories from 2016 to 2022, said, "The scale of Palestinian civilian deaths in such a short period of time appears to be the highest such civilian casualty rate in the 21st century. Since October the 7th last year, more than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip and 1.8 million displaced. And the gendered impact of the crisis in Gaza, a report produced by the UN Women in January estimates that close to 1 million women and girls have been displaced. 70% of deaths are women or children. 3,000 women have become new widows. And given the number of displaced women and those living in temporary shelters, we've also got to consider the ongoing impacts of that, as the other speakers have already outlined. But in addition, we know that 5,500 women are expected to give birth in Gaza in the next month. Women and girls in Gaza are cutting out small pieces of tents they rely on for shelter from the cold and rain to use as a substitute for period products. The UN Women report also highlighted the impact of the conflict on social progress and women's freedom, setting out how women increasingly fear that in light of food shortages, school closures, and loss of educational opportunities, families will resort to desperate coping measures, including early marriage. We've also seen an escalating and unprecedented violence on aid workers, health workers, and journalists who've been killed. Schools and hospitals destroyed, often when run by UNRWA as shelters. The conflict is a war on civilians, and it is a war on women, and it has to stop. Now, I have consistently called for a ceasefire since the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October, which we understand killed many innocent women themselves. And it is clear that a great many colleagues here in Parliament have defended the specific Israeli military tactics of siege, cutting off water, food, electricity, that it was clear would punish civilians. It is right that the weight of campaigning pressure is driving more politicians to talk of a ceasefire, but we really do not have time to waste. The UN Women report concluded the most urgent need is for an immediate ceasefire and unfettered access to aid. We must also, here in the UK, ensure an end to arms sales, to ensure the UK restores its suspended funding of UNRWA, as the EU has recently done, and acts to centre women and girls as part of its Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan. And thanks to everybody on this call and who are listening for all that you do. Just one final brief point, as I don't have time to address this in full, but I am conscious the solidarity movement is increasingly being subjected to a smear campaign that conflates real security issues, real security risks elected representatives may have from lone and isolated extremists with the legitimate lobbying the solidarity movement does. Now, I challenged that last week in the chamber, and I and colleagues will continue to do so. Because as women and activists for equality here in the UK, we owe it to those in Gaza and across the globe to stand up for peace and secure an immediate ceasefire. Solidarity. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr, Beth. Thank you so much. And if you've got your speech written out, do send it to Matt so we can publish it, because there was a lot of really important information that you managed to get across there. Thank you. Right, our fifth speaker is Hilary Schan. We're delighted you're with us, Hilary. She is the co-chair of Momentum. The floor is yours, Hilary.
Thanks so much, Christine, and thank you to Labour and Palestine and to Arise for having me and for organising this important event. It's amazing to be on a panel with such inspirational women, and I just wanted to say particular solidarity with Apsana, who has been treated so despicably by the Labour Party, and also more recently the mainstream media as well, for her unrelenting stance in standing up for the people of Palestine. So solidarity. International Women's Day always feels like such an important moment to come together as women and recognise the collective challenges we continue to face and the disproportionate impact of structural inequality on us all as women. But this year, however, feels even more important as an event of collective international solidarity as we see what is happening in Gaza on a daily basis. And once again, the impact of this brutal war is disproportionately affecting women and children. As Beth has said, of the more than 30,000 Palestinians killed so far, the UN estimates 70% are women and children, and nearly 1 million women and girls have been displaced. Women, children and newborns in Gaza are disproportionately bearing the burden of the escalation of hostilities, both as casualties and in their reduced access to health services. Women are having caesarean sections, staying in tents and expected to get up, look after children, look after their families, cook and flee to safety within hours and without medication. There are stories of women refusing to eat or drink in pregnancy just to avoid needing the toilet. There has been an increase in sexual assault and harassment due to the lack of safe areas, and there is no reporting infrastructure left. Women and girls are using rags for sanitary products, resulting in infections because they are unable to wash effectively. These are truly unimaginable horrors, and I'm sure we've all had conversations with people, family and friends who say they don't watch the news anymore because it's too depressing or they feel hopeless. But to look away is complicity. Silence is violence. These women are heroes, and as the primary caregivers, they will bear the brunt of the intergenerational trauma that will exist for years to come. In the British media, we're already seeing the horrors in Gaza falling down the agenda in favour of the culture war taking place in British politics. The government this week alone is considering a ban on MPs and councillors having any involvement with organisations such as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. This is convenient not just to escalate the view that those fighting for peace are somehow terrorists, but it also takes away the headlines from what is really happening on the ground. And as a Labour councillor in Worthing, I will say categorically that I will not be cowed by this, and I will continue to speak out, to march and to fight. 2 weeks ago in Worthing, where I'm a councillor, we were proud to receive a deputation from our local Parents for Peace group, led by an incredible group of local women, asking us to back a motion for an immediate ceasefire. Such was the power of the spokeswoman's speech. The motion passed unanimously, including the Tory opposition. Just one example from across the nation and world where women are campaigning and standing with the women and people of Palestine. So it's incumbent on all of us on this International Women's Day to make the voices of Palestinian women heard, to share their stories, say their names, and ensure that people continue to take to the streets at every opportunity and to fight for an immediate ceasefire and for peace. At Momentum, we've been consistently pressuring the Labour Party leadership on this, including our lobbying tool, which has over 5,000 people using it to contact Labour MPs and the leadership to push them to back an immediate ceasefire. We are pleased, of course, that the position has shifted in the way that it has, but frankly, it should never have taken that long, and it is still not an unequivocal position that calls for a full and immediate ceasefire. And it is clear that the Labour Party leadership are still unwilling to stand up to the Israeli government and insist that they stop their brutal massacre of the Palestinian people. Just last week in the Rochdale by-election, we saw how much the party has underestimated the strength of feeling about Gaza. And polling shows this is echoed across the country with the Muslim population, amongst who they have completely lost confidence and support. I've seen that in my own local Muslim community, where our Muslim councillors locally have been repeatedly asked by their communities why they continue to represent a party complicit in this genocide. I agree with Jess, however, that Labour are worried. No nationwide polling can legislate for candidates standing in support of Palestine. And as we saw in Rochdale, they ignore this at their peril. So as we draw nearer to a general election, we cannot allow the real story of Gaza to be dwarfed by Labour's factional games or the culture war rhetoric of the Tories. And we must expose the hypocrisy of the Labour Party when they suspend councillors, as happened in Lambeth last week, including Martin Abrams, Momentum NCG member and a Jewish councillor in Lambeth, for supporting what is now essentially Labour Party policy, simply in their continued factional purge of those on the left. They are now willing to use the greatest humanitarian catastrophe of our time as a vehicle to further their political project. They are abhorrent. So this International Women's Day, let's use our collective strength to fight back and be the voice of those that need us and continue to fight for an immediate ceasefire and liberation for Palestine. At the Momentum Convention this weekend, we'll be discussing Gaza and how we campaign in the most effective way on this issue going forwards. So if you are a Momentum member and registered, please do come along on Sunday. Once again, thank you so much for having me on this amazing platform of women, and solidarity to you all.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you for mentioning intergenerational trauma, because of course, appalling as everything is in Gaza, even if there's a ceasefire, the matter is not resolved. There is so much more that needs to be done. Anyway, let me move to our sixth speaker in her second meeting of the evening, in which I've been a part. So thanks to the miracle of technology, I'm now going to introduce Louise Reagan, who is currently a National Executive Member of the NEU and the Chair of the NEU's International Committee, and a very long time and very vigorous supporter of women in Palestine and speaking out on behalf of the Palestinian cause and amplifying the voice of Palestinians. Louise, we're delighted to have you. The floor is yours.
No, thanks, Christine, and thank you to all the other fantastic speakers who have spoken so brilliantly about the horrific situation that we are currently facing. I'm very proud to be a member of the National Education Union. I'm very proud of the work that our union has done over decades, actually, standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I, along with many of our members, have been shocked by what we have witnessed and what we are hearing from our partners in Palestine. As others have said, over 30,000 killed in Gaza, 2/3 of those are women and children. A shocking statement, really, that we all keep saying, but these are just numbers, but those are people. They were children, women who had dreams, who had futures, who had names, who we just keep hearing these, horrific figures of. There's been no education in Gaza since the 7th of October. All of the universities have now been destroyed, and the majority of schools have faced some form of destruction, if not total destruction. Huge devastation of homes, of safety for children and young people. Quite a shocking statistic, really. I also listened to the ICJ debate and listened to the case from South Africa. I mean, there were some shocking statistics in there. The one that I cannot get out of my head is that 10 children a day face an amputation with no anaesthetic. I have no ability to comprehend that as a figure or a statistic and think that people cannot be shocked by that. I teach children every day as an educator. I can't imagine how horrific that must be. Last weekend, we heard from a medic who had come back from Gaza who told us about a child who'd had to have both his hands amputated and asked his parents in tears if his hands would grow back. This is what the children in Gaza are facing, and yet we have governments that remain silent. People in Gaza have nowhere to go. There is no safe place in Gaza for the children, for the women, for any of the civilians who are trying to escape what is happening. The International Court of Justice could not have been clearer. Israel must prevent genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and enable the provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. Yet as the bombs and missiles rain down in Rafah, it is hard to imagine a more flagrant abuse of that order by our government and others. Rather than suspending arms sales to Israel, our government halted funding for UNRWA, the only source of any humanitarian aid for the 2 million Gazans trapped there. And instead of de-escalating the conflict, they escalated it through airstrikes on Yemen. And they continue to abstain on UN votes for a ceasefire. And that's why many charities have stated that what is happening now will end up with our UK government being complicit in the slaughter of civilians in Gaza. And Jess referred to this also. I think people, obviously our eyes are on Gaza, but the situation in the West Bank is horrific. West Bank is where we take our delegations. We have many partners there. We have many friends in the West Bank, teachers, educators, working in schools. Death rates are at the highest they have been since recording. 413 Palestinians killed since the 7th of October, 107 of those children, and continued arrests and detention of children, often, as we know, taken in the middle of the night. The NEU has stood firm on this from the start of the assault on Gaza. Our General Secretary, our National President, and myself have all spoken at national demonstrations and made clear our position as a union that we call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire and that we call for humanitarian aid to be allowed in. We've encouraged our members to attend demonstrations and take their union banners, take part in the trade union bloc. And our members by themselves have set up an Educators for Palestine group to campaign and build support for what is happening in our schools. And there has been a huge attempt to shut down discussions about what is happening in our schools. The NEU is very clear. The place that children need to be discussing it's in the safe space that is their school. Children and young people need an opportunity to talk about what they are seeing and what they are hearing, and to be able to do that safely in their schools and colleges with the support of educators who understand what is happening. We've set up a specific page now to support our members, and we also have set up a fundraiser with children in need and raised a huge amount of money already through our districts and our members to send much needed support into the children in Gaza. And we will continue to do all we can to support the situation. We will continue to speak out. We will not be silenced, And we will continue to stand in solidarity with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, our partner organisation, and speak out in defence of the work that they are doing, standing up for the people of Palestine. And as others have said, this did not begin on the 7th of October. Palestinians have suffered decades of oppression and dispossession. So yes, we must continue to do all that we can to push for a permanent ceasefire now. We must push for humanitarian aid to be allowed in and for the borders to be open. But then we have a duty now to continue this movement and to fight for a long-term justice for the people of Palestine, something that they have deserved for decades and something that they have been failed upon. And now is the time for us to do that. Thank you.
Louise, thank you very much. And we should be in no doubt that this is actually a global movement. We're here in part in celebration of International Women's Day, and internationally there are calls for governments all over the place to end arms sales to Israel, and there are calls all over the place from the peoples in different countries to call for an immediate ceasefire. So whilst the women and children and men in Gaza are indeed suffering terribly, we must reassure ourselves that they do know that there is international support for them, and we must not tire of calling for that, or tire of putting our efforts into making sure that we push our politicians as hard as we possibly can. I'm now going to come to our final speaker. Just before I do, I just want to say that there are lots of messages in the chat about donating, in particular to Arise, who's providing all the technical for this evening to make sure that these meetings can happen. So if you can possibly donate to that, please do, but also make sure that you think about donating to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. There are very, very many calls on the resources that they have at the moment, so they need everything we can provide for them. So our last speaker is Rifka Barnard, who comes from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign to close this meeting. So over to you, Rifka.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks as always to Labour in Palestine for organising this event and for all the work that you're doing otherwise. And of course, it's a huge honour to share this panel with such a brilliant group of women campaigners, and I'm grateful for Labour in Palestine bringing us all together to speak. I have to say it was particularly difficult to put together my comments for this evening and to speak about Palestine now, not because last year when I was speaking on International Women's Day, the occupation was easy, or that somehow apartheid was light touch in previous years, but obviously the challenges and the current situation, the catastrophe is different this year, and because of the unprecedented scale of horrors being inflicted on the Palestinian people daily, which we all know and many people have said already are now being investigated in the International Court of Justice as a case of genocide. Others have spoken already about the particular impact this violence has had on women, the conditions facing tens of thousands of Palestinian women in the Gaza Strip who are pregnant in a situation where they're being constantly bombed, displaced multiple times, and often living in tents or temporary shelters with no health care available, since part of Israel's war has been the pointed and intentional obliteration of Gaza's already overstretched hospitals. Women are giving birth without access to clean water, medicine, and those who are in medical facilities requiring C-sections or having those operations done without anesthetics. And of course, others have mentioned also the indignity women and girls are facing of having no supplies to attend to their menstrual cycles, not to mention privacy, something that's just an unimaginable luxury for them to even dream about in the conditions they're facing right now. And then, of course, on top of all of this, the famine facing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. The bombing they're being subjected to, the ground invasions, the forced disappearances by Israeli military, and the torture and ill treatment in prisons, which doesn't spare women and children. Of course, women and children are subjected to that as well. As always, as comrades have already said before me, the burden of war and colonialism hits women doubly hard. But also, as always, Palestinian women are no exception to the global phenomenon of women being at the forefront of the struggle for justice and in service of their people. And I want to pay tribute today to all of the Palestinian women who are courageously facing these unprecedented challenges. And people have mentioned some of them: the doctors, the nurses, the medical workers who are saving lives, or in many cases providing comfort to the dying in the Gaza Strip, the teachers and community activists who are organizing lessons and play for Palestinian children in shelters, children whose lives will never be the same after this if they even survive, and in situations where the structure of a group activity might be the only thing that can bring a smile to their faces. The women who are working as journalists, and particularly in the Gaza Strip, where international media has no access, who are diligently reporting and documenting both the violence against, but also the strength of their people. The mothers, the sisters, the aunties, and the others who are at the same time very ordinary people in some ways, but actually extraordinary women who are working to keep their community together in the face of such unimaginable horrors. And these are the women who will never be celebrated by name in international forums, who won't become news sensations or heroes, but whose work is the foundational work that Palestinian women have been doing for decades to uplift their people, and the work that's inspired so many of us, including myself. So what is our responsibility as people of conscience in the solidarity movement right now in the face of all of this horrific violence that we've been describing, but also in the face of such inspiring courage and strength from Palestinian women? And as Christine mentioned in her introduction, what do we do in the face of the unprecedented British complicity in Israel's violence and government attempts to stifle and silence our solidarity movement, which have really reached a fevered pitch in the past week? At the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, our priority, and the priority across the solidarity movement, of course, is to work tirelessly for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And I think all of you will know we're planning another massive national march this Saturday, and I'm really proud and really excited to say that this weekend we'll have an entire lineup of women speaking in support of a ceasefire and an end to British arms sales to Israel. So if you're ever going to come out to one of these marches, this weekend is the one to do it. And I'm sure some of the brilliant women on this panel actually will be speaking there this weekend, and if not, marching alongside us all. I want to say also, in advance of this event tonight, I spoke to a Palestinian friend in the occupied West Bank, and she asked me to mention specifically how important it's been for her and for her comrades to see our marches in London. Of course, the purpose of our marches is to put pressure on politicians here in Britain to take action, but our marches also provide comfort and hope to Palestinians around the world, including in occupied Palestine, to see that they haven't been forgotten by the majority of the people in the world, even if they've been forsaken yet again by those in power. There's so much more for us to do in our campaigning, marching for a ceasefire, organizing local actions, which people have been doing brilliantly around the country, keeping up our Stop Arming Israel campaign, and starting new campaigns to push for accountability and to support the Palestinian call for justice. So thanks to all of you who have showed up today, and I think everyone will be taking away some great ideas and information, as people always do from every Labour in Palestine event, and I hope to see all of you in London this Saturday in the streets for our next Ceasefire Now march.
Rivka, thank you very much indeed. Comrades and friends and sisters, at 70 years plus, I've lived through times when there have been so many conflicts. There's practically never been a year when the whole world has been at peace since I've been alive. But I can honestly say that I have never been so struck, so moved, so angered as I feel at this appalling situation in Gaza. I can't there's not really any time when I stop thinking about it. And the stories that Louise tells of children imagining that perhaps their hands will grow back. I mean, it's just unimaginable how awful life must be for everyone living in the Gaza Strip. So we absolutely just have to do everything. We have to do everything that we possibly can. And one of the things that you've done this evening is to actually come along and listen to this. And I hope that everyone who's on the call will go away with new energy to talk about this terrible situation and to make sure that we win everyone round to the need to stop arms sales to Israel and to bring about an immediate ceasefire and everything else that we need to do. So I just, on behalf of everyone who joined the meeting, I thank you. I thank all our speakers very, very much. And from all our speakers, I'm sure I thank everyone who's actually come and listened, and thanks to Labour and Palestine volunteers for organising this and for the Arise Festival volunteers for setting it up. As Labour movement activists who have always stood with Palestinian people internationally, it's absolutely our job to raise this awareness and to speak up and to never, ever imagine that we will stop taking to the streets to make the case for peace and justice, in particular at this time for our Palestinian friends.